The golden light from the 65 candles on the massive cake flickered in Benedict Sterling's cataract-clouded eyes, dancing like malevolent spirits on the polished mahogany table. At 65, Benedict was still a mountain of a man. Silver hair swept back with military precision, a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, and a presence that commanded the air in any room he entered. He was a titan of industry, a man who had built the Sterling Empire from the red dust of construction sites into a skyscraper-laden kingdom. The dining room of the Sterling Manor was an altar to excess. The air was thick with the rich, heavy scents of Wagyu ribeye, aged Bordeaux, and the lingering blue smoke of a $500 cigar. Surrounding him were the people he considered his greatest legacy: his daughter, Eleanor, whose elegance he had funded; his son, Harrison, whose debts he had vanished; and Julian, his son-in-law and the man Benedict had groomed to be the prince of his empire. To 65 years of power, Julian said, his voice a smooth, rich baritone that had always reminded Benedict of expensive cello music. He stood at the head of the table, raising a crystal flute of vintage Krug. "You've given us everything, Benedict. A name, a future. Tonight, we simply ask that you let us take the weight off your shoulders. You've carried the world for long enough. Rest, and let the light of this family guide you." Benedict smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the deep-set flinty lines of his face. He felt a swell of uncharacteristic emotion. For 4 decades, he had been a wolf in a world of sharks, cold and calculated, making the hard choices to ensure the Sterling name remained synonymous with invincibility. But tonight, watching his children's faces glowing in the candlelight, he allowed himself to believe he had finally reached the shore. He had built a fortress not just of steel and glass, but of blood and loyalty. "Make a wish, Dad," Eleanor whispered, leaning in to brush a kiss against his weathered cheek. "But don't say it out loud, or the magic breaks." Benedict closed his eyes. He didn't wish for more wealth. He had more than several lifetimes could exhaust. He didn't wish for more time. He knew the clock only marched in one direction. He wished for this singular moment of perceived peace, to be the truth of his remaining years. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of his own success, and blew. The candles died instantly. A thin, gray ribbon of smoke curled into the air, and for a heartbeat, the room was plunged into a heavy, unnatural darkness. In that sudden void, before the electric chandeliers could hum back to life, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a sudden drop in pressure that made the hairs on Benedict's arms stand up. He couldn't see it, but he felt the silent, predatory communication pass between his children. A sharp nod from Julian. A cold, steady gaze from Eleanor. The warmth of the celebration evaporated, replaced by the sterile chill of an operating room. When the lights flickered on, the faces around the table had changed. The festive masks had slipped, revealing the jagged edges of ambition underneath. "The light is out," Julian said, his voice no longer like a cello, but like the snap of a dry twig. He didn't sit back down. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek, leather-bound folder. He slid it across the mahogany, stopping it right next to Benedict's half-eaten slice of cake. Benedict frowned, his blue eyes narrowing. "Julian, what is this?" "We agreed. No business on the birthday." "This isn't business, Benedict. It's a transition," Julian replied, his eyes devoid of the warmth they had held only moments before. "The Sterling Empire is a different beast than the one you conquered 40 years ago. It's faster, leaner, more ruthless. It doesn't need a monument, it needs a ghost. We've prepared a special instrument, a legacy trust. It's designed to protect every cent you've ever made from the volatility of the current market. It places your assets into a vault that no lawsuit, no tax man, and no rival can ever touch." Eleanor stepped behind her father, her hands resting on his shoulders. Her grip was firm, perhaps too firm. "It's about your peace of mind, Dad. You've earned the right to stop looking over your shoulder. Just sign the management transfer, and you can spend the rest of your days at the estate in Tuscany without ever hearing the word dividend again." Benedict looked down at the documents. His vision, usually sharp, felt slightly blurred by the wine and the overwhelming emotion of the evening. He saw the complex legal jargon, the familiar names of the holding companies, and the dizzying arrays of zeros. His predatory instinct, the one that had saved him 1,000 times before, gave a faint, rhythmic thump in his chest, a warning. But then he felt Eleanor's hand on his shoulder, the daughter he had walked down the aisle, the girl who used to cry when he left for business trips. He looked at Julian, the man he had treated like the son he never truly had. He allowed the father in him to kill the wolf. "You're sure this is what's best for the family?" Benedict asked, his voice sounding older than it had 5 minutes ago. "It's the only way to keep the Sterling light burning," Julian said, leaning forward, his shadow stretching long across the table. Benedict picked up the heavy gold fountain pen. It felt leaden in his hand. With a slow, deliberate motion, he scrawled the signature that had authorized the construction of cities and the destruction of rivals. He signed the primary document, then the 3 writers, and finally the power of attorney disclosure. He didn't notice the fine print that stripped him of his executive veto, nor the clause that transferred the title of the Sterling Manor, this very house, to a shell company controlled entirely by Julian. The moment the ink dried on the final page, Julian snatched the folder back. He closed it with a sharp, final thud that echoed like a gavel. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian didn't offer a celebratory drink. He didn't thank him. He simply stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, looking at Benedict as if he were a piece of furniture that had suddenly become an eyesore. "What's wrong?" Benedict asked, the first seeds of dread beginning to sprout in his gut. "Julian?" "Eleanor." Eleanor pulled her hands away from his shoulders as if his skin had turned to ice. She walked to the other side of the room and began pouring herself a fresh drink, her back turned to him. "Happy birthday, Benedict," Julian said, the word dad now officially purged from his vocabulary. "You've played your part perfectly, but you were wrong about one thing. This wasn't a celebration of your life." Julian leaned in close, his face inches from Benedict's. "It was a wake. And you just signed your own death certificate." Benedict stared at them, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then that while he had been making a wish for their future under the flickering candles, they had already been blowing out the light of his life, leaving him to rot in a darkness he had built with his own hands. The silence that followed the snap of the folder was more than just the absence of sound. It was the vacuum of a collapsed life. Benedict Sterling sat frozen, his hand still hovering over the mahogany where his golden pen lay like a discarded weapon. The candlelight, once warm and celebratory, now felt like the flickering eyes of a predator watching its prey bleed out. "Julian," Benedict started, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "What is this? You're talking as if I'm no longer here." Julian didn't answer. He turned to the window, watching his own reflection in the dark glass. It was Eleanor who spoke next. She didn't look at her father. She was busy swirling the amber liquid in her glass, the ice cubes clinking with a rhythmic, funeral-like precision. "It's simple, Dad," she said, her voice devoid of the filial affection she had wielded like a scalpel moments before. "You've become a liability. Your old-school methods, your stubborn refusal to pivot into high-risk digital assets. You were choking the life out of the Sterling name. We aren't just your children anymore. We are the board of directors, and the board has decided to retire you." "Retire me?" Benedict stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. The movement was meant to be commanding, but for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his 65 years. His knees felt hollow. "I built this house. I built the very chair you're sitting in, Eleanor. You can't just retire the man who owns the air you breathe." Julian turned back then, a thin, pitying smile curling his lips. "That's the thing, Benedict. You don't own it. Not anymore. If you had read this special gift on page 42, you would have seen the clause regarding the immediate dissolution of your residency rights upon the transfer of the power of attorney. This house belongs to Sterling Global Holdings, and Sterling Global Holdings is now under my sole signatures." Benedict's heart gave a violent, sickening lurch. He looked at the legal folder, then at his son-in-law. "Julian, I treated you like a son. I gave you my daughter's hand. I gave you a seat at the table when no one else would look at you. And I thank you for that," Julian said, walking slowly toward Benedict until they were inches apart. The smell of Benedict's own expensive cigar clung to Julian's breath. "You taught me everything I know. You taught me that in this world, there are those who take and those who are taken from. You're just getting old, Benedict. You forgot how to be the one who takes. Julian reached out and, with a terrifyingly casual gesture, flicked a stray crumb of birthday cake off Benedict's lapel. The car is waiting outside, Julian said softly. Your suitcases were packed this afternoon while you were taking your nap. We found a very quiet, very secure facility in the countryside. They specialize in cognitive decline, which, given your sudden inability to understand legal documents, seems like a fitting diagnosis. Cognitive decline? Benedict's voice rose to a roar, the old lion finally baring his teeth. I am as sharp as the day I took your father's firm apart, Julian. You are stealing my life in broad daylight. Who's going to believe you? Eleanor interjected, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were cold, beautiful, and utterly empty. The staff has been paid off and dismissed. The medical reports are already filed. To the world, Benedict Sterling has suffered a quiet, tragic mental collapse on his 65th birthday. A sad end to a great man. She stepped closer, her perfume, a scent Benedict had bought her for Christmas, filling his nostrils. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Dad. Go quietly. If you fight, it only proves we were right about your instability. Benedict looked from his daughter to his son-in-law. He looked at the shadows dancing on the walls, and for the first time, he realized the house felt like a tomb. Every luxury he had surrounded himself with was now a bar in his cage. He reached for the phone on the sideboard, his fingers trembling with rage. I'm calling the police. I'm calling my lawyers, he hissed. Julian didn't even move to stop him. He watched with an amused expression as Benedict lifted the receiver. There was no dial tone, only a hollow, dead silence. Benedict pressed the buttons frantically, but the digital display remained dark. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, but the screen was shattered, the internal components crushed, as if someone had stepped on it with a heavy boot. The lines are down, Benedict. A storm casualty, I believe, Julian said, checking his watch. The transport team is here. They aren't as patient as we are. Two men in sterile, gray uniforms appeared in the doorway of the dining room. They were large, silent, and carried the unmistakable aura of hired muscle, disguised as medical professionals. No, Benedict whispered, backing away until he hit the sideboard. A crystal vase, an antique from the Ming dynasty, shattered on the floor behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. You can't do this. Harrison? Where is Harrison? Harrison is already at the club, celebrating his new position as vice chair, Eleanor said, checking her makeup in a hand mirror. He didn't have the stomach for the eviction phase. He always was the soft one. The two men stepped forward. Benedict felt a surge of adrenaline, the primal instinct of a man who had survived the cutthroat streets of his youth. He grabbed a heavy silver candle snuffer from the table, brandishing it like a club. Stay back, he barked. Julian sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. We were hoping to do this with dignity, Benedict. But I suppose a scene is more your style. The men didn't hesitate. They moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency. Benedict swung the silver tool, but his movements were slowed by age and the wine. One man caught his arm, twisting it behind his back with a sickening pop, while the other pinned him against the table. Benedict's face was pressed into the white linen, inches away from the smear of chocolate frosting from his birthday cake. Eleanor, help me, he gasped, the air being squeezed out of his lungs. His daughter didn't even look up from her mirror. Make sure he doesn't bruise his face, she said casually. The facility takes photos upon intake. We need him to look confused, not abused. As they dragged him toward the door, Benedict fought with everything he had. He kicked, he bit, he screamed names that had once made world leaders tremble. But in this house, his sanctuary, he was no longer a king. He was a ghost being exorcised. They hauled him through the grand foyer, past the portraits of his ancestors, and out into the biting, midnight air. The freezing rain immediately soaked through his silk shirt, chilling him to the bone. A black van with tinted windows sat idling in the driveway, its exhaust pluming like the breath of a dragon. Julian stood on the threshold of the manor, the warm light of the foyer silhouetting his frame. He held a small object in his hand. It was the nameplate from the front door, the one that read Benedict Sterling. With a casual flick of his wrist, Julian tossed the heavy brass plate into the mud at Benedict's feet. While you were busy carving our names into your heart, Benedict, Julian called out over the wind. We were busy erasing yours from the door. You're a man without a home now. A man without a name. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, the sound echoing like a tombstone being slid into place. The locks clicked, the very locks Benedict had installed to keep the world out. Now, they were keeping him out. As the gray-clad men shoved him into the dark maw of the van, Benedict Sterling looked back one last time. The candles on his cake were still flickering in the window, tiny sparks of light in a house that had suddenly gone cold. They had blown out the light of his life, but as the van pulled away into the storm, a different kind of light began to glow deep within Benedict's soul. It wasn't the warmth of love or the glow of success. It was the cold, white-hot spark of a man who had lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. The black van did not head toward a luxury care facility or even a hospital. It drove for hours, deeper into the rural outskirts where the streetlights grew sparse and the asphalt turned to gravel. Inside the windowless cabin, Benedict Sterling sat on a cold metal bench, his hands bound with plastic zip ties that bit into his weathered wrists. The adrenaline that had fueled his struggle in the dining room was beginning to ebb, replaced by a terrifying, bone-deep realization. Julian wasn't just hiding him away. He was discarding him. The van came to a jarring halt. The rear doors swung open, admitting a blast of sub-zero air and needles of freezing rain. One of the gray-clad men grabbed Benedict by the collar of his silk shirt and hauled him out. Benedict tumbled onto the muddy verge of a desolate road, his knees striking the frozen earth with a dull thud. "Where are we?" Benedict gasped, his breath visible in the headlights' glare. "This isn't a facility. This is nowhere." The man didn't answer. He reached back into the van, pulled out a thin, tattered wool coat, the kind worn by laborers, and tossed it into the mud next to Benedict. Then, he leaned down, his face a mask of indifference. "Julian said to tell you. This is the retirement you deserve. No name, no money, no witnesses. Just the silence." The van doors slammed shut. The engine roared, tires spitting slush and gravel as it sped back toward the city. Benedict watched the red taillights fade into the darkness until he was left in total, suffocating silence. The cold was an immediate, physical assault. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing his skin, seeking the heat in his marrow. Benedict tried to stand, but his legs were stiff, his joints locked by the temperature. He crawled toward the tattered coat, his fingers fumbling with the fabric. It was damp and smelled of diesel, but it was his only shield. He pulled it over his shivering frame, the cheap wool scratchy against his skin, a far cry from the cashmere and silk that had defined his life for 40 years. "I am Benedict Sterling," he whispered into the wind, his voice a jagged rasp. "I built the horizon. I won't die in the dirt." He began to walk. Every step was a battle against the wind that tried to push him back. His thin loafers offered no protection. Soon, he could no longer feel his toes. His mind began to wander, drifting back to the dining room. He could still see the flickering candles. He could still hear Eleanor's laughter, the laughter he had paid for with his soul. He thought of the skyscrapers he had erected, the monuments to his ego that were now being managed by the very snakes who had bitten him. The irony was a bitter pill. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, to protect his family from the vultures. He had never realized the vultures were already inside, perched on his own shoulders, waiting for him to blink. Hours passed. The rain turned to heavy, wet snow that clung to his eyelashes. His heart, once the engine of an empire, was faltering, skipping beats like a failing machine. Benedict felt a dangerous warmth spreading through his limbs, the onset of terminal hypothermia. He knew what it meant. His body was giving up, sending its last reserves of heat to his core for a final stand. He saw a faint light in the distance, a flickering orange glow that seemed to sway with the wind. He thought it was a hallucination, a cruel trick of his dying brain. But as he crested a small ridge, he saw it clearly. A small fire burning in a rusted oil drum beneath a crumbling bridge. Benedict collapsed 20 feet from the fire. He couldn't move his legs anymore. He dragged himself forward with his elbows, his chin scraping the frozen mud. "Help," he croaked, but the sound was barely louder than a snowflake hitting the ground. A figure emerged from the shadows beneath the bridge. It was a man, huddled in layers of mismatched rags, his face obscured by a thick, matted beard. The stranger looked down at the man in the mud, a man wearing a $5,000 watch and a laborer's coat. "You look like you've seen the end of the world, friend," the stranger said. His voice was gravelly but held a strange, rhythmic calm. The stranger hauled Benedict toward the fire. The heat hit Benedict's face like a physical blow, painful and life-giving. As he lay there, shivering violently as the blood began to flow again, he looked up at the man who had saved him. "My name is Benedict." He started, but the stranger held up a hand. "Names don't mean much out here under the concrete," the man said, stirring the embers with a piece of rebar. "Under here, you're just a ghost, like the rest of us. The world up there, the one with the lights and the towers, it doesn't see ghosts." Benedict looked at his hands. The skin was blue, the nails cracked. His gold wedding ring, the one he had worn for 35 years, was gone, likely taken by the men in the van. He looked at the fire, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a businessman or a tycoon in the reflection. He saw a man who had been stripped to his molecular essence. "They took everything," Benedict whispered. "No," the stranger replied, looking him in the eye. "They took your things. They took your house. But you're still breathing. That means they haven't taken the only thing that matters." "What's that?" "The chance to burn it all down," the man said with a dark, knowing grin. While Julian was likely sitting in Benedict's study, sipping Benedict's cognac and staring at Benedict's view, Benedict was sitting in the dirt, learning a lesson he had forgotten long ago. A man with everything has everything to lose. But a man with nothing is the most dangerous creature on earth. As the sun began to rise, a pale, sickly gray light filtered through the snow. Benedict didn't look like a victim anymore. His eyes, though sunken and red, had lost their confusion. The cognitive decline Julian had hoped for was replaced by a terrifying, singular clarity. He looked at the bridge above them. He could hear the faint hum of tires on the asphalt, the world moving on, believing Benedict Sterling was dead or insane. "They think they blew out the light," Benedict said to the fire, his voice now steady and cold. He reached into the flames and picked up a charred piece of wood. On the concrete pillar of the bridge, he began to write. He didn't write his name. He didn't write a plea for help. He began to sketch a map of the Sterling Empire's deepest, darkest vulnerabilities. Every offshore account, every forged signature, every skeleton he had helped Julian hide. While the candles on his cake had flickered out, the fire in the oil drum was just beginning to grow. Benedict Sterling was gone. In his place, a ghost was rising, one who knew exactly where the foundations of the house were cracked. "I'm not going to a facility," Benedict whispered to the rising sun. "I'm going home, but not as a father, and not as a guest." The hook was set. The world thought it had finished with Benedict Sterling, but the ghost under the bridge was about to show them that some lights don't go out. They just wait for the right moment to turn into a forest fire. The bridge wasn't just a shelter. It was a purgatory where the ghost of Benedict Sterling began to shed the skin of a billionaire. For 3 days, he lived in the soot and the damp, eating scorched scraps provided by the stranger, who called himself Silas. Silas was a man who had once been a high-level forensic accountant before a convenient mental breakdown, orchestrated by the same banks he was auditing, sent him to the shadows. Under the flickering orange light of the oil drum, 2 men discarded by the world they built began to trade secrets like currency. Benedict's hands, once manicured and soft, were now stained with charcoal and grime. Using a jagged piece of rebar, he scratched complex diagrams into the concrete pillars of the bridge. These weren't floor plans for skyscrapers. They were the flowcharts of Julian's greed. Benedict knew every shell company in the Cayman Islands, every backdated signature on the merger documents, and every offshore account that Julian had used to skim from the Sterling Empire. While Julian thought he had buried his father-in-law, he had actually sent him to the only man in the city capable of weaponizing his own ledgers. "You're not just looking for revenge, Benedict," Silas whispered one night, his eyes reflecting the dying embers. "You're looking for a reckoning. But a ghost can't sue a king. You need a body. You need a presence." "I have something better than a presence," Benedict replied, his voice regaining the steel that had once made CEOs tremble. "I have the one thing Julian hasn't realized yet. The power of attorney he forced me to sign was for Sterling Global Holdings. But the primary land deeds, the actual earth the buildings sit on, are held by a defunct trust in my late wife's name. A trust that requires a fingerprint scan and a biometric key. He has the crown, Silas. But I still hold the keys to the castle. While the snow continued to bury the city above, Benedict began his transformation. He didn't need his bespoke suits or his gold watch. He needed the invisibility that the world granted to the broken. Silas helped him procure a set of grease-stained coveralls and a heavy, hooded work jacket. Benedict cropped his silver hair with a pair of rusted shears and rubbed soot into the deep lines of his face. When he looked at his reflection in a puddle of oily water, he didn't see the titan of industry. He saw a nameless janitor, a shadow in the hallway. The plan was simple but suicidal. Julian was hosting a victory gala at the Sterling Plaza to celebrate the full integration of the new management. It was the perfect stage. Julian loved the spotlight. He would be center stage, basking in the praise of the city's elite, thinking the man who built the room was freezing to death in a ditch. "They won't see you coming," Silas said, handing Benedict a small, encrypted thumb drive they had salvaged and wiped. "To them, you're just a glitch in the system, a beggar at the gates. But remember, Benedict, once you step back into that light, the ghost dies. You have to be ready for what comes next." Benedict stood at the edge of the bridge's shadow, the wind whipping his hood. "The ghost isn't the one who should be afraid, Silas. It's the people who think they can live in a house built on a grave." Benedict began the long walk back to the heart of the city. He walked past the bus stops where his face had once been on the cover of magazines. He walked past the restaurants where he had closed billion-dollar deals. No one looked at him. Not the socialites in their furs, not the security guards at the bank entrances. He was a ghost in broad daylight, a silent witness to the world he had created and was now about to dismantle. He reached the Sterling Plaza as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows over the glass towers. Limousines were already lining up, disgorging the wealthy and the powerful. Benedict watched from a darkened alleyway across the street. He saw Eleanor step out of a car, draped in diamonds that could have fed 1,000 men like Silas for a lifetime. He saw Julian, looking radiant and predatory, shaking hands with the mayor. They were laughing, a bright, hollow sound that cut through the cold air. While they sipped champagne in the warmth of the penthouse, Benedict moved toward the service entrance. He didn't try to sneak past the guards. He simply walked with the heavy, tired gait of a man who belonged there, a man who had spent his life cleaning up other people's messes. He carried a bucket and a mop, his head down, his identity shielded by the universal apathy the rich have for the help. Inside, the building breathed with a rhythm Benedict knew by heart. He knew which elevator bypassed the security sensors. He knew the maintenance codes that Julian hadn't bothered to change. As he climbed the service stairs, his heart hammered, not with fear, but with a cold, focused precision. He reached the main server room on the 40th floor. This was the brain of the empire. While the music from the gala drifted up through the vents, a haunting, orchestral version of the song they had played at his birthday party, Benedict approached the biometric terminal. This was the hook. If Julian had updated the system, Benedict would be trapped, caught by the very security he had designed. He reached out a trembling, grime-covered hand and pressed his thumb against the glass scanner. The red light flickered. A heartbeat passed. Then, with a soft, mechanical chime, the light turned green. "Access granted, Sterling, B." Benedict let out a breath he felt he had been holding since the night of the storm. He wasn't just back in the system, he was the system. He inserted Silas's drive and began the process of the Great Reset. On the floors above, the gala was reaching its crescendo. Julian was stepping up to the podium, the microphone humming as he prepared to announce his grand vision for the future, a future built on the theft of a father's life. But beneath his feet, the digital foundations were already beginning to liquefy. "Enjoy your moment, Julian," Benedict whispered into the darkness of the server room. "Because while you were blowing out the light of my life, you forgot that I'm the one who wired the building." The screen in front of him began to glow with a series of red alerts. Asterisk, deed transfer initiated. Asset freeze confirmed. Security lockdown, level alpha, asterisk. The hook was set. The ghost was no longer under the bridge. He was in the wires, in the walls, and in the very air they breathed. Benedict Sterling didn't need to kill them. He was going to make them watch as the world they stole evaporated in the time it took to finish a toast. The ballroom of the Sterling Plaza was a sea of silk, diamonds, and forced laughter. High above the city streets, The elite gathered under the warmth of thousand-bulb chandeliers, blissfully unaware that 40 floors beneath them, the ghost of Benedict Sterling was systematically pulling the plug on their reality. Julian stood on the raised dais, a glass of crystal-clear gin in his hand, looking every bit the conquering hero. He was charming, young, and most importantly, he was in control. Beside him, Eleanor smiled for the cameras, her eyes bright with the thrill of a life no longer shadowed by her father's overbearing morality. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian's voice amplified through the hidden speakers, smooth as velvet. Tonight, we don't just celebrate a merger. We celebrate a new era. For too long, Sterling Global was a prisoner of the past, held back by outdated traditions and a refusal to embrace the speed of the future. But tonight, that weight is gone. Asterisk the hook asterisk as Julian raised his glass for the toast, the massive floor-to-ceiling digital displays behind him, designed to show the soaring stocks of the new company, suddenly flickered, the bright green lines bleeding into a violent, pulsing red. In the server room, Benedict didn't look at the screens. He watched the lines of code. He was the architect of this system, and he knew that Julian's greatest weakness was his arrogance. He had never bothered to change the emergency level alpha overrides that Benedict had installed a decade ago. With a few keystrokes, Benedict bypassed the firewalls and initiated a total asset freeze. It was a digital guillotine. Every credit card associated with the Sterling name, every corporate account, and every offshore wire transfer currently in progress was instantly paralyzed. Benedict leaned back, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the monitors. He felt a strange sense of detachment. He wasn't the man who had built the empire anymore. He was the man who was burning it to keep himself warm. He picked up a headset, patching himself into the ballroom's audio feed. "Julian," Benedict whispered into the microphone. His voice didn't just carry through the headset. He routed it to the main speakers in the ballroom, distorted and deepened by a voice modulator, sounding like a tremor from the earth itself. "You always did have a problem with the fine print." In the ballroom, the music died. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the 300 guests. Julian froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He looked at the red screens behind him, then at the speakers. "Who is this? Is this some kind of joke?" "The joke is the deed in your pocket, Julian." The voice boomed, vibrating the very floorboards. "Check the timestamp on the power of attorney. You'll find that while you were throwing a man into a storm, he was already 2 steps ahead of your greed." Asterisk the hook asterisk suddenly. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, not into a romantic glow, but into a rhythmic, pulsing emergency red. The high-tech security doors at every exit hummed and hissed, the heavy titanium deadbolts sliding into place with a series of thunderous clacks. The guests began to panic, the sound of breaking glass and stifled screams filling the air. "What are you doing?" Julian screamed at the ceiling, his poise shattering. "Security. Shut it down. Track the source." "Security can't help you," Benedict's voice echoed. "They work for the man who pays them. And as of 60 seconds ago, the Sterling Global payroll account is empty. I've redistributed the funds to the ghosts of this city, the people you stepped on to get to that podium." Eleanor grabbed Julian's arm, her face pale. "Julian, the phones, my cards, nothing is working." Benedict watched the internal security cameras. He saw his daughter's terror, and for a fleeting second, a pang of the old Benedict, the father, shook his resolve. But then he remembered the cold. He remembered the smell of the diesel-soaked wool coat and the feeling of the frozen mud against his cheek. He remembered the silence of the woman who had watched her father being pushed into a blizzard. "You said I was a ghost, Julian," Benedict said, his voice now calm and terrifyingly clear, dropping the modulator. "And you were right. But ghosts don't just disappear. They haunt. They reveal the rot behind the walls. Look at the screens." The red lines on the digital displays vanished, replaced by a scrolling list of names and numbers. It was the Black Ledger, the record of Julian's money laundering, the bribes paid to the mayor, and the forged medical reports used to declare Benedict Sterling mentally unfit. The guests, many of whom were complicit in Julian's rise, began to shrink away from the dais as their own names appeared in the damning data. "You're finished," Benedict said. "The police are already at the lobby doors. But they aren't here to rescue you. They're here for the fraud you committed when you signed my name to a lie." The hook Julian lunged for the podium, trying to tear the wires out, but a secondary security measure, a localized EMP Benedict had programmed for high-security breaches, discharged with a brilliant blue flash. The entire digital infrastructure of the ballroom died. In the sudden, pitch-black darkness, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the police battering rams hitting the ground floor doors. Benedict pulled the thumb drive from the server and stood up. He felt lighter than he had in years. He had spent his life building a cage of gold, and he had finally found the courage to break the locks. He walked out of the server room and headed for the service stairs, but he didn't go down toward the police. He went up. He reached the rooftop helipad just as the first sirens began to wail in the streets below. The city was a grid of light, beautiful and indifferent. Benedict took the tattered laborer's coat he had worn under the bridge and draped it over a high-end lounge chair. He looked at the Sterling Plaza sign, glowing brilliantly against the night sky. He pulled a small remote from his pocket, the final piece of Silas's handiwork. While the candles flickered, Benedict whispered to the wind, "You thought you were blowing out my life, but you were just giving me a reason to see in the dark." The hook he pressed the button. The Sterling sign didn't just turn off. It short-circuited in a choreographed sequence of sparks that spelled out a single, final word across the skyline for the entire city to see: reckoning. As the first helicopter searchlights swept across the roof, Benedict didn't run. He walked to the very edge of the building, looking down at the chaos he had unleashed. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't a father. He was a man who had finally made his final wish. And for the first time in 65 years, he was truly, terrifyingly free. The flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers danced across the glass facade of Sterling Plaza like a frantic heartbeat. Inside the lobby, the once impenetrable security detail stood frozen, their digital access badges blinking red, dead plastic in a dead system. Benedict Sterling stood on the rooftop helipad, the wind howling around him, tearing at the laborer's jacket he wore over his soul. He looked down at the city he had built, a grid of light that had once been his ego, now merely a witness to his justice. 40 floors below, the ballroom was a scene from a nightmare. The emergency lights pulsed with the rhythm of an alarm, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. Julian was screaming at a security guard who no longer cared. Eleanor was huddled in a corner, her silk gown stained with spilled wine, her eyes wide as she watched her own name scroll across the massive screens alongside bank routing numbers and offshore coordinates. The black ledger was ruthless. It didn't just expose Julian's fraud. It detailed every bribe Eleanor had accepted to stay silent about her father's disappearance. The hook just as the heavy ballroom doors were finally breached by the federal task force, every screen in the room went black. A second later, a single image appeared, a high-definition live feed from a hidden camera in Benedict's private study, recorded 3 months ago. In the video, Julian and Eleanor were seen laughing as they rehearsed the sad announcement of Benedict's death. Julian was seen practicing his grieving face in the mirror while holding Benedict's antique gold watch. "The old man is already a ghost." Julian's voice rang out through the ballroom speakers, clear and damning. "We're just doing the world a favor by making it official." The silence that followed the video was heavier than the darkness. The guests, the elite of the city, recoiled from the couple as if they were infected. The federal agents moved in, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing through the vaulted ceiling. Julian tried to run toward the service elevator, but Benedict had already locked the shaft. He was trapped in the very penthouse he had stolen. On the roof, Benedict heard the muffled sound of the arrests through his headset. He closed his eyes, expecting to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of the old wolf energy that had fueled his youth. But there was only a vast, cold emptiness. He realized that revenge was like the storm. It cleared the air, but it left everything frozen in its wake. He had destroyed the people who betrayed him, but he had also destroyed the only family he had left. "Benedict," a voice crackled through the comms. It was Silas, calling from the bridge. "The files are fully uploaded to the public servers. By morning, Julian won't just be a criminal, he'll be a pariah. You did it. The ghost has a name again." "No, Silas," Benedict said, looking out at the horizon. "The name is what started all this. People kill for names. They betray for titles. I'm done with the name Sterling. Asterisk the hook asterisk Benedict reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key fob, the master control for the Sterling Plaza's structural lights. With a single flick of his thumb, he didn't just turn off the sign. He initiated a sequence that blew every fuse in the building's exterior. In a massive wave of sparks and shattering glass, the Sterling name literally fell from the sky, the heavy brass letters plummeting 40 stories to the street below. He walked toward the service stairs, but he didn't head down to meet the police or the press. He knew Julian and Eleanor would spend the next 20 years in a concrete box, haunted by the memories of the luxury they threw away. That was their prison. Benedict's prison had been the Sterling Plaza itself, and he had just burned the keys. As he reached the ground floor, he slipped out of a side exit, merging with the crowd of onlookers and reporters. In his soot-stained coat and hooded sweatshirt, he looked like just another witness to the tragedy. He walked past the police line, past the frantic reporters, and toward the subway entrance. A young girl, no older than 10, was standing by the subway stairs, shivering in the cold. She looked at Benedict, not at his clothes, but at his eyes. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked softly. Benedict paused. For 40 years, people had looked at him with fear, respect, or greed. No one had ever asked if he was okay. He reached into his pocket and found a small, silver coin, a lucky piece he had kept since he was a boy, the only thing Julian hadn't found. He placed it in the girl's hand. "I'm better than I've been in a long time," he whispered. Asterisk the hook asterisk as he stepped onto the train, he saw his own face on the overhead news monitor. The headline read, "Tycoon Benedict Sterling declared dead after Plaza disaster." Benedict smiled. It was the perfect ending. The world thought he was dead. Julian and Eleanor were ruined. And Benedict was standing in a crowded subway car, anonymous and penniless. But for the first time in 65 years, he wasn't looking at a balance sheet. He was looking at the faces of the people around him. The train rattled into the darkness of the tunnel. While the candles on his cake had been blown out, and the light of his old life was gone, Benedict realized that the darkness wasn't his enemy. It was his camouflage. He was going back to the bridge. Not to hide, but to find Silas. They had a new project. There were hundreds of other ghosts in this city, men and women erased by the powerful, discarded by their own blood. Benedict had spent his life building skyscrapers that touched the clouds. Now, he was going to build a foundation for the people in the dirt. The final hook remained. Julian sat in the back of a police cruiser, staring at the empty rooftop. He was convinced he saw a figure standing there, a shadow against the moon. He began to scream that his father-in-law was a demon, a ghost that couldn't be killed. The officers exchanged a look and tapped their temples. To the law, Benedict was a victim. To the world, he was a tragedy. But to Julian, he would forever be the light that stayed on long after the candles were gone. Benedict was gone, but the reckoning had only just begun. The city did not wake up to a new day. It woke up to a new world. The headlines were a tidal wave of scandal, and by dawn, the Sterling Plaza was no longer a symbol of prestige, but a crime scene cordoned off by miles of yellow tape. Julian and Eleanor were not just in jail. They were being dismantled by the very legal systems they had once used as weapons. Their bank accounts were frozen, their reputations incinerated, and the Black Ledger continued to leak secrets onto the internet, exposing every politician and fixer who had helped them bury Benedict Sterling. But Benedict was not watching the news. He was standing on the same desolate road where, months ago, he had been left to die in the snow. The storm was gone now, replaced by the pale, hesitant warmth of an early spring sun. He wore the same tattered laborer's coat, but beneath it, his posture was no longer that of a victim. He looked at the muddy verge where he had once crawled for his life, and he felt a strange sense of gratitude for the cold. It had burned away everything that wasn't real. Asterisk the hook asterisk Benedict reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the only thing he had recovered from his private safe before the lockdown. It was a picture of a much younger man, standing in front of a half-finished brick wall, holding a toddler Eleanor in his arms. He didn't feel anger looking at it. He felt the weight of a final, devastating truth. He had built an empire to protect his children, but in doing so, he had taught them that power was the only thing worth having. He hadn't just been betrayed by them. He had authored the blueprint for their corruption. He tore the photograph into a dozen pieces and let the wind carry them into the tall grass. He wasn't Benedict Sterling anymore. That man had died in the blizzard. He walked back toward the bridge, where Silas was waiting. The ghost colony had grown. Word had spread through the shadows of the city about a man who knew how to fight back, a man who understood the architecture of power and how to collapse it from within. Benedict found Silas sitting by the same oil drum, but the fire inside was different now. It was fueled by purpose. "The lawyers are calling it the greatest corporate collapse in history," Silas said, looking up from a battered laptop. "They're searching for you everywhere, Benedict. They want to know where the money went. They want to know if the architect is real." "The money is where it belongs," Benedict replied, sitting on a crate. "It's in the community centers they tried to close. It's in the legal funds for families they tried to evict. And as for the architect, let them keep searching for a ghost. A ghost can be anywhere." Benedict opened a new file on the laptop. It wasn't a ledger or a map of a building. It was a list of names, hundreds of them. These were the elderly forgotten in neglected facilities, the whistleblowers silenced by NDAs, and the fathers thrown out by their own kin. He realized that while Julian had tried to blow out the light of his life, he had accidentally illuminated an entire army of shadows waiting for a leader. "We aren't just going to haunt them, Silas," Benedict said, his voice echoing under the concrete vault. "We are going to build something they can't buy. We are going to build a foundation that doesn't rely on names on a door." Months passed. The Sterling Plaza was eventually sold to a faceless holding company at a fraction of its value. Julian sat in a gray cell, staring at a wall, wondering how a dead man had outplayed him. Eleanor spent her days in a state-appointed lawyer's office, learning what it felt like to be a number instead of a name. They waited for a visit, for a letter, for a sign of mercy from the father they had discarded. But the silence was absolute. Benedict knew that the greatest punishment for people who worshipped the spotlight was to be forgotten in the dark. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Benedict stood on a hill overlooking the city. He was no longer alone. A dozen men and women stood behind him. His new board of directors, people who had lost everything and gained a terrifying clarity. They were the invisible workforce that kept the city running, the janitors, the clerks, the couriers. Benedict pulled a small, silver matchbox from his pocket. He struck a match, the small flame flickering in the twilight. It was the same size as the candles on his 65th birthday cake. "Last year, I made a wish," he whispered to the wind. "I wished to see the truth. Today, I'm making a new one." He dropped the match into a small pile of dry leaves at his feet. As the fire caught, he didn't look at the flames. He looked at the people standing with him. For 65 years, he had believed that his legacy was made of steel and glass. He had been wrong. A legacy isn't what you leave for people, it's what you leave in them. While they were blowing out the light, Benedict said, turning to his new family, "They forgot that some fires don't need a candle. They just need a reason to burn." Far below in the city, the lights of the old Sterling Plaza suddenly flickered and died. A total blackout hit the district, plunging the symbols of greed into darkness. But in the shadows of the alleys, under the bridges, and in the small, forgotten apartments of the poor, small lights began to flicker on, one by one, thousands of them. Benedict Sterling was gone, but the architect was just getting started. He walked away from the hill, leaving the fire behind him, his steps steady and his heart finally, truly quiet. He had spent his life building things that were meant to last forever, only to find that the only thing that truly did was the truth of who you are when everything else is stripped away. The man who had been thrown out into the snow had finally come home, not to a mansion, but to himself. And as the city sat in the dark, the ghosts began to move, led by a man who knew exactly how to navigate the night. While the world thought it was the end of a story, Benedict knew it was just the first page of a reckoning that would never end.